Steve, hello.
Hey, Justin, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, And I'm glad that we're together again because we did a nice piece of work called The Value Seeking Consumer. As you know, this was a pretty big research project. We had 3,600 brands evaluated by consumers. We had almost 1 million different pieces of consumer data rating brands on their price, on their value, as well as our whole consumer signals data set on how consumers' behaviors and spending patterns are changing over time. And we discovered something pretty interesting and I think pretty useful about this trend called the value-seeking consumer. Now, we can quantify that. So about 4 in 10 consumers in the US are considered value-seeking. Or we've recently done a global look at this, and we find that almost half of global consumers are value seekers. So there's a few things I want to ask you about, including what is a value-seeking consumer?
Sure, Justin. Value is an interesting concept, right? And what we were able to determine is that these value seekers are looking for something that's worth it, right? Worth it to them. And in terms of that, it goes beyond the price. It's not just something that is less expensive, more affordable.
Right.
But they're seeking something other than just price. And so when you look at it, they're looking at deals, they're looking at trading convenience, they're looking at some simplicity in their life. So value seekers are interesting. Now, what's a myth to bust with value seeking is you might think that they come from low-income households exclusively. But to your point, we found quite a few value seekers out there, and 1 in 4 households making over $200K are value seekers.
That's right. And I mentioned that global refresh. We looked at 3 different income groups globally across the 15 countries that we do consumer signals, and 35% of that high income group are also value seekers. So if you're considering when you hear the word value that means that we're talking only about lower income households, it's really becoming a broad swath of all consumers of all types. I even consider myself a value seeker.
Oh, so do I.
Yeah.
Totally.
But that's not the only myth that we have to bust here, because when people or companies hear the idea of value, sometimes that's thought of as like a synonym for cheap. And that was one of the other myths that we busted, correct?
Correct. So it doesn't equal cheap. Value can happen at every price point. And one of the interesting things with our more value for price framework is that it goes up and down the price scale, right? So you can be that cost-cutting brand that's trying to get the person who's truly looking for the lowest price.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can be that brand that is offering some non-price driver that people perceive as a value.
In fact, that's one of my favorite things about this power of the MVP framework, is that by taking those million consumer responses as they evaluate brands on things like price and value, you can line all that data up, do a regression, and that allows you to kind of level the playing field between how value is thought of for, say, that lower price grocer that you're talking about, and value can be also present in that, more high-end, high-experience grocery. And it's about providing more value than would have been expected at that price point, doing that something extra. Steve, what are some of the something extras that these brands are offering that is kind of common among MVP, more value for price brands?
Well, when we looked across a number of different subsectors, so here I'm thinking apparel, grocery, hotel, automotive, etc. There were a couple of themes that stood out. Quality is not a surprise, but people associate quality with value. So getting quality for the price that you've just handed somebody. The second is trust. It's really interesting. And actually, if you're a higher priced brand, you really work the trust angle pretty hard. We found that trust was even stronger with them because they've got to win you over, right? And then there's attitude. And attitude's an interesting one. It's just, am I being respected? Do they understand me? Are they knowledgeable about what they're trying to sell me, be it a product or service? So it's really interesting. And as you use a fairly simple framework, right? We're literally on the x-axis price, on the y-axis value and looking at that regression that you mentioned, if you're above that line, you're more value for price brand. And I know that we were able to double click on some drivers beyond the ones I mentioned. So, you looked at grocery pretty hard. What were some of those, when you double clicked on a subsector like grocery, that you recall more value for price players pulling on?
Yeah, so some of those kind of common themes definitely come up, although they come up in a grocery context. So take attitude, winning attitude. Well, in the grocery context, that's, the associate, the store associate, how they show up, how helpful they are. That was one of the drivers. But then there are some like very grocery specific things, like the speed of the checkout. Now, we've all stood in line at a grocery store. We have our thoughts about like that experience. When we looked deeper in the consumer data, speed of checkout was important, especially when it comes to once you get to the register. So consumers were willing to wait in line a little bit as long as when they got to the register, that process went really well. Our MVP companies, they really stood out in that dimension.
Yeah, and if I extend it to, say, something like hotels, right? What's really interesting is right now, luxury brands and hotels are having a moment. Right? They're doing better than your down market brands. So what's happening there, right? They have higher revenue per average room, and they're offering up something of more value. Higher end service, location, to your point, the attitude really comes to play. You can run across a number of different subsectors and apply the same framework, and it shows just these new insights, specific subsector driving insights. And what I find really interesting is really getting into those non-price drivers. So Justin, hotels are one of my favorite subsectors. Do you have another one?
Thinking about the automotive space, which I had a recent experience with. I take my car to the dealership in order to get its normal maintenance and stuff, in part because of the same kinds of MVP differentiators that the automotive sector had in our study. So it's things like higher trust. I know I may be paying a little bit more, but I trust the service department, how smooth that goes, how friendly, those interactions can make a big difference. So that's something that comes to mind for me. Steve, we got into the more value for price framework, but I think it's important that we discuss why we know that this is a powerful, useful framework. And that comes out in a few ways, right? In our research, there's net purchase intent, and then there's actually seeing household share shift.
So, when we looked at it, and we are able to segment by more value for price players, and we should say that a third of brands out there are more value for price players. When you segment them,
two-thirds aren't.
Which means two-thirds aren't. And it's interesting, right? Because it holds up pretty much as you move from subsector to subsector. But when you look at them and you look at more value for price players versus the others, what you find is that their net purchase intent over a 3-year period is consistently higher. So what that means is people are planning to spend, right? So forward intent. Then when we looked at share shift, right, using credit card data, we saw household share shift to the more value for price players. So in the case of, say, grocery, it was a 2% share shift over that same 3-year period. Kind of amazing. And then thirdly, does Wall Street recognize this? Well, we looked at economic value, right? We looked at the multiplier effect, looking at economic value over EBITDA. And we did see a very significant correlation with economic value. So you've got the intention, you've got the backwards looking share shift, and then you've got the economic value. So it's a solid methodology, right?
So MVP, not just a clever name.
Yeah, and it has practical implications for the C-suite because, as you know, Wall Street's always looking for alternative data sources.
Sure.
And
yes.
they have seen this as well. So there are certain analysts using this as a screen, right? And so the C-suite is starting to think about, okay, am I an MVP brand? And they should, right? Because it matters to consumers and it matters to Wall Street.
Well, Steve, I really enjoyed working with you, as I always do, but in particular on this more value for price, value-seeking consumer work. And I look forward to what's next.
I appreciate that, Justin. And what's next is we're going to deep dive into a number of subsectors so that we can better understand what those non-price drivers are. So stay tuned.